It was the light that drew me first. A thin, persistent flame trembling in a window above the north quad of St. Bride's, refusing the dark with a quiet obstinacy that struck me, even then, as almost human. Oxford has a way of exaggerating small things. A shadow across a cloister, the sound of a latch turned after midnight, the sudden bloom of candlelight behind leaded glass. I had come for a lecture I did not wish to attend Milton. I think it was, though the invitation had appealed to that perverse side of me which finds solace in other people's certainties. The hall was half empty, the air dry with chalk and age. The speaker's voice wandered through familiar verses about rebellion and reason, while my attention drifted to the rustle of pages, the scent of wax polish, the faint echo of rain beginning against the roof. I'd once known a woman who loved Milton, who said that paradise was not lost but postponed. She had left Oxford, and I, characteristically, had not followed. It is a small city, yet it preserves distance like a habit. When the lecture ended, I found myself walking through the quad instead of leaving it. The drizzle had turned to mist. I paused under the archway, looking up again at that same window where the light burned with the same steady defiance. Someone, I thought, was waiting for the night to end, or unwilling to admit it had begun. Lewis found me there a few hours later, which was odd, since I had not told him I was coming. He was in his usual state of mild impatience, coat damp, eyes bright with the prospect of something practical. "There's been a death, sir," he said, though not unkindly. "The bursar, Dr. Andrew Fenton. Natural causes, according to the report. The porters found him in his room early this morning. I asked why he had come to me at all. He hesitated, then said the master thought it best that someone should take a quiet look. Reputation and all that. I understood. St. Bride's is one of those small colleges that mistake discretion for virtue. I agreed, though not before remarking that my interest in natural causes was usually limited to the kind found in the bottle. Lewis smiled, but his expression did not linger. He seemed troubled by something he could not yet name. We crossed the quad together, our steps muffled on the wet stone. Inside the bursar's staircase, the air was heavy with polish and extinguished smoke. Fenton's rooms were neat to the point of denial, books squared in military rows, papers aligned as if obedience might ward off mortality. On the nightstand, beside an empty glass and a bottle of pills, stood a candle burned down only halfway. The wax had cooled into a shallow spiral, delicate as a fingerprint. Lewis read from his notebook. Time of discovery. No sign of struggle, door locked from the inside. I nodded, but my thoughts had already strayed to that candle. If he had died in the small hours, the wick should have melted further, unless, of course, it had not been lit until later. I said nothing aloud. Deductions voiced too early have a way of evaporating. There was another thing, the faint trace of perfume, incongruous in such masculine order. Lewis noticed it too, though he said only that the windows were sealed and the air felt wrong. He was right. Rooms often keep their own kind of witness. This one spoke of a company recently departed. As we left, I looked once more at the light in the window, now guttering in the morning wind. Perhaps it was the same candle I had seen from the quad hours before, or perhaps another altogether. Either way, its refusal to die on time had begun to trouble me. In Oxford, even candles appear to keep secrets, and I had learned too late, too often, that secrets burn more slowly than they should. I have never trusted tidy deaths. They have a way of arranging themselves too neatly, as though the world were suddenly inclined towards symmetry. Lewis had the look of a man who wanted it all to add up: one body, one heart attack, one unsigned letter to the doctor, and who thought it impolite of me to insist otherwise. Yet even before I crossed the threshold of Fenton's rooms that morning, I knew the arithmetic would not hold. Nothing that begins in Oxford ever ends with simplicity. The coroner's report lay open on the desk beside the typewriter. Cardiac arrest, the words declared, final and untroubled. But it was not the official prose that caught me. It was the smell of wax. A thin thread of it lingered in the air, faint as regret. Someone had snuffed a candle long after the moment of necessity? Lewis stood by the bookcase, reading titles as though they might confess something. He told me the master had requested tact, that the college wished to avoid embarrassment. Reputation was the most delicate of currencies here, and Fenton, it seemed, had been a generous man with other people's money. I asked about the glass on the nightstand. There were two, one dry, one stained faintly at the rim. Lewis shrugged. Visitors, perhaps. Yet there had been no sign of another person, and the porter swore no one had entered the staircase after 10. The master herself, Dr. Lorna Vane, received me in her study, a room of measured elegance. The window overlooked the chapel garden. The curtains were drawn just enough to let in civility, but not truth. She spoke of Fenton with professional sorrow, of his service to the college, of the tragedy of a life spent in dedication to figures and ledgers. I listened, though my eyes wandered to the desk, where a single sheet of paper lay half covered by an envelope. A letter addressed in her own hand to Fenton. The ink is still new, the words beneath unreadable. She asked me, quite gently, to spare the college unnecessary attention. Her voice carried the assurance of someone who believed discretion a virtue beyond honesty. I promised nothing. When she offered sherry, I declined. It seemed too early for pretense. Outside, Lewis was waiting under the cloisters, chewing on an apple in the rain. He told me Fenton's daughter had been notified that she would arrive from London by evening. I asked if the porter had mentioned lights in the Bursar's window after midnight. He had, Lewis said. A candle. But that was probably just an old-fashioned habit. I said that habits die slower than men, and that some flames are kept alive for reasons not entirely devotional. He laughed, but without conviction. Back in my office, I looked again at the photograph of the scene. The body angled too perfectly, the sheet folded with the care of ritual. A tidy death indeed. I poured myself a small whiskey, letting it sit untouched. There was a crossword open on Fenton's desk in the photograph, a clue circled in pencil time's undoing. 4 letters. I thought about that for a long while. By late afternoon, the sky over Oxford had bruised to violet. I walked to the Radcliffe camera, seeking nothing but silence, and found instead the echo of a footstep behind me, a woman perhaps, though when I turned, the passage was empty. I have never liked coincidences. They are too often the disguise of intent. When I returned home that night, I could still see the candle in my mind burn to the middle, steady as confession. Someone had watched it long enough to know how slowly wax forgets heat. And I, for reasons I could not yet explain, felt certain that Fenton's death had been arranged not by chaos, but by design, an ending composed for appearance's sake, like a verse left deliberately unfinished. Oxford, I thought, remains the only place where even a heart can die in proper grammar. Oxford breeds intelligence the way old houses breed dust invisibly, inevitably, and in corners no one quite reaches. At St. Bride's, the dust was of a distinguished kind, the remnants of arguments once brilliant, now fossilized. I had spent that morning among the company of scholars, each of them convinced of his own innocence in the abstract sense. Guilt, they implied, was for those without tenure. Lewis accompanied me with his usual mixture of respect and skepticism. He prefers people who say what they mean. Oxford prefers the opposite. I sometimes think his plainness of manners is the most forensic instrument I possess. He disarms by not knowing he does. The first of them was Professor Adrian Lyle, tall, grey, the kind of man who arranges his tie with the same deliberation as his sentences. He spoke of Fenton as one might of a once promising student who'd grown disappointing. They had shared an office once, he said, before Fenton's promotion. That last word hung like an accusation. Lyle's books on Milton were stacked neatly behind him, all bearing his own photograph on the jacket. I asked what he thought of Fenton's scholarship. Lyle smiled thinly and said that Andrew was not overburdened by originality. Then he added, almost as an afterthought, that he had always admired Fenton. Punctuality. I've learned that envy often hides behind compliments of efficiency. It was the first note I made. Judith Larkin, the college secretary, was next the kind of woman who noticed everything and confessed nothing. She had the unnerving calm of one who knows how to erase mistakes with administrative precision. She told me she had locked Fenton's office herself after the body was removed. Her eyes drifted toward the window when I asked if she had seen anyone there the night before. She said no, too carefully. On her desk was a blotter, immaculate but for a single smudge of wax. I touched it lightly, said nothing. Then there was Dr. Peter Alden, the theologian, an apologetic man with the pallor of someone who spends too much time parsing virtue. He told us he'd been dining at Magdalene that evening, a detail inserted too readily. When pressed, he couldn't recall the menu. He spoke of Fenton's generosity, of loans given and never repaid, and I noticed a tremor in his fingers when I mentioned the bursar's account books. It wasn't guilt I saw in him, but fear of exposure, not of crime, perhaps, but of debt. Oxford has always confused morality with embarrassment. Emily Fenton arrived while I was taking notes in the hall. She was younger than I'd expected, mid-30s, perhaps with that blend of beauty and exhaustion found in people who think too much about memory. She disliked her father, that much was plain, though she tried to disguise it as indifference. She said he had cared more for numbers than for people, and that his greatest talent was in arranging appearances. Her voice trembled only once when she mentioned the college's new library, a project her father had pushed through against opposition. I wondered briefly whether legacy had been his final preoccupation. By the time we returned to the quad, the drizzle had deepened into steady rain. Lewis said it all seemed clear enough: a man disliked, a heart worn out, a convenient end. I told him that clarity is the enemy of truth. He frowned, as he always does, when philosophy intrudes upon his sense of order. I envied him for that certainty. Back in my room that evening, I poured a modest whiskey and opened the small notebook I keep for cases that smell of intellect rather than blood. On one page, I wrote their names: Lyle, Larkin, Alden, Emily. Beneath them, a single line from a crossword I'd half finished on the bus, all in the same boat, yet none rowing. 5 letters. I had filled in unity earlier that morning, but now I erased it. The company of scholars, I thought, was rarely united in anything except pretense. Somewhere beyond the window, the chapel bell began its slow toll. It was the hour when Oxford turned inward, when conversations in common rooms shifted from gossip to guilt. And as I listened to the rain collect on the sill, I realized that among those 4 faces, someone had watched a candle burn far longer than they should have. Someone who understood, as I did, that the line between light and concealment was thinner than wax. It was the cleaner who found it, a woman named Mrs. Prowse, who spoke in the hush of someone accustomed to secrets not her own. She had been dusting the fireplace in Fenton's rooms when her cloth caught a blackened scrap that drifted to the floor like a moth's wing. I remember how she looked at me when she handed it over, half fearful, half relieved, as if she'd passed on a contagion. I laid it flat on my desk beneath the lamp. Most of it had crumbled into unreadable ash, but a few words clung stubbornly to the page, their edges singed but not destroyed. Though the field was lost, the line stirred a faint irritation before recognition arrived. Milton again. I'd heard it quoted badly during that wretched lecture on the night of the candle, but this version had been altered. The next phrase was missing, replaced by something faintly scrawled: "The reckoning waits within." A paraphrase, or perhaps a warning. Fenton, or someone else, had tried to burn the page, but not well enough. The fire had faltered, as though conscience itself had grown damp. Lewis thought it trivial. He was standing by the window, peering out at the quad. "Always that drizzle," he said, as though the weather itself conspired to dull his curiosity. I told him that Milton didn't die in the fire, and neither, perhaps, did the truth. He looked at me the way he always did when poetry intruded upon police work, then asked if I fancied a sandwich. I said no, and he left. I spent the next hour with the note under magnification. The paper was torn from a letterhead belonging to the college, the ink slightly faded, as though written in haste or by candlelight. The handwriting wasn't Fenton's. His hand was angular. Exactly, this was looping, feminine, perhaps deliberate in its disguise. Whoever wrote it had hesitated at the word within. There was a hesitation mark, a pause of pressure, an afterthought. I began to wonder who or what the field might be, a metaphor or a memory. The porter brought in the college key register later that afternoon, a record of borrowed rooms. It showed that Judith Larkin had signed out the spare key to Fenton's staircase 2 nights before his death, ostensibly to repair the bursar's lock. The entry had been crossed through and rewritten in another hand. I touched the page and could feel the indentation beneath the ink, faint as remorse. The forgery was elegant, but not invisible. Most lies are too careful. When I called on Larkin, she greeted me with her usual composure. The scent of candle wax hung in the air again, faintly sweet. She said she had indeed borrowed the key, but only briefly, and had returned it that same night. Her eyes didn't shift when she spoke, though her hands moved restlessly across her desk, aligning papers already straight. I noticed a small burn on her thumb, almost healed. She caught me seeing it and smiled. Administrative hazards, she said. I let it rest, though the phrase echoed later in my head. A convenient lie wears its ordinariness too comfortably. That evening I walked back through the college grounds, where the rain had given the stones a darker intelligence. In the chapel window, candles flickered against the dusk, reflections trembling in the puddles at my feet. I thought of the note again, its half-obliteration, its reluctant survival. There was something unfinished in it, like a confession interrupted. Back in my flat, I placed the fragment inside a book of verse to keep it from further disintegration. I poured a whiskey and stared at the flame on my lighter, small and steady. I thought about how quickly paper yields to heat, and how rarely people do. The fire in Fenton's room had not been fierce enough to consume his secret, only to announce that one existed. And somewhere between Milton's lost field and the reckoning within, I felt the faint stirrings of an answer, or perhaps only its shadow. In my line of work, they are often the same thing. Time, I have learned, is the most deceitful of witnesses. It tells you everything you wish to believe, then withdraws its testimony the moment you begin to trust it. That day, standing in the bursar's rooms once again, I felt the peculiar stillness of a space arranged to deceive time itself. Fenton had always been meticulous, the sort of man who measured life by ledgers, the tick of a watch, the slow melt of wax. Yet the candle on his nightstand told a story that his clock refused to corroborate. Lewis was crouched beside the mantelpiece, tapping his pencil against the marble as if impatience might coax the truth from stone. The pathologist's report said Fenton died shortly after midnight, yet the candle half burned suggested a far shorter vigil. I asked whether anyone might have replaced it. Lewis frowned, said the porter was certain nothing had been moved. But certainty is a dangerous word in Oxford. It belongs more to theology than to investigation. The window was still streaked with the faint residue of rain, and in that blurred glass I caught my own reflection of a man older than he wished to be, tired not by questions, but by people's determination to answer them too soon. On the desk lay Fenton's pocket diary, open to the final page. A single notation in his precise, finicky hand. 11:30, last light. I stared at the words until they began to lose their meaning. Last light could have referred to anything. A college inspection, a final candle, or the small moment before death when the mind itself dims. But the time, that careful entry, refused to fit. Lewis found the matches in a silver box by the bed. "Only one stick is missing," he said. "Perhaps the man fell asleep, that the flame simply expired before he did." "Possible," I admitted. But the pool of wax beneath the candlestick was smooth, deliberate, as though the candle had burned uninterrupted, not snuffed out by accident or fatigue. "It had been replaced," I said finally, though I could not yet prove it. Lewis asked what sort of person replaces a candle for the dead. "Someone afraid of being seen in the dark," I replied. Later that afternoon, I spoke to Emily Fenton in the garden behind the master's lodge. She stood smoking, coat collar turned up against the drizzle. When I mentioned the candle, she smiled, not in amusement, but in memory. Her father, she said, had a habit of marking time by wax, not clocks. He would burn a candle down to a certain notch to remind himself when to take his medication. "It made him feel independent," she added. I asked who knew of this ritual. She hesitated. "Everyone, I suppose. Oxford isn't good at secrets." I disagreed silently. "It's perfect for them." Back in my flat, I tried to reconstruct the scene from habit. Candle, clock, diary, 3 instruments of time, each telling a different story. The diary gave me a deliberate hour. The clock had stopped at 1:27. The candle, half melted, marked an hour unaccounted for. Between those 3 silences, something human had moved. I took out a crossword from the Times that Fenton had half completed the morning before his death. One clue circled faintly in pencil, measure of duration, 6 letters. He had written the wrong answer, memory. I stared at that word for a long while. Near midnight, the city settled into the sound of distant bells, a passing bicycle, the sigh of rain against stone. I thought of that candle again, of how it must have burned with the patience of someone waiting for forgiveness. A man dies, and what remains is not the truth, but the arrangement of time around his absence. The candle and the clock are 2 liars, 2 accomplices, each guarding the other's deception. I poured a drink and watched the amber rise against the glass, like a small private sunrise. It struck me then that in Oxford, nothing burns at its natural pace, not candles, not consciences, not even the past. It was the solicitor's briefcase that betrayed the mood of the afternoon. Polished, nervous, too new for a man who dealt daily in death. He had come from London, announced by the porter as though carrying a relic rather than a document. The will of Dr. Andrew Fenton, late bursar of St. Bride's College, read the small card in his hand. Its Latin text had already drawn whispers in the senior common room. A dead language for a dead man, someone had said, though not quite softly enough. Lewis sat beside me at the long oak table, hands folded in that uneasy mixture of curiosity and skepticism. I could see his reflection in the varnish, the only man in the room not pretending composure. The master, Dr. Lorna Vane, presided from the far end, her expression one of brittle grace. She nodded for the reading to begin. The solicitor adjusted his spectacles, cleared his throat, and began to translate. The words unfolded like a psalm, ornate and indifferent. Fenton had left modest sums to various charities, a token to the porter, and the remainder, the great remainder, to St. Bride's College, for the establishment of a library dedicated to the pursuit of truth and virtue. I could almost hear Lewis shift beside me at that, but the Latin phrase was not so simple ad veritatem et virtutem collendam. Cultivate truth and virtue. A gardener's verb, not a philosopher's. Fenton had never cultivated anything in his life. He had only tallied, measured, and accounted. The solicitor continued. There was an amendment, he said, a codicil dated 2 weeks before Fenton's death. It reassigned administrative control of the fund to one Dr. Lorna Vane. A small rustle passed through the room, the polite scandal of academia. The master's face did not move, though her hand gripped the chair as though she might steady time itself. She thanked the man coolly and asked that copies be circulated to the college council. Lewis looked at me, his question unspoken. I nodded slightly. Yes, it mattered. Outside, the courtyard had flooded with late afternoon rain. I watched the drops fall into the cloistered pond, concentric ripples colliding and vanishing. Fenton's will had been written in the same style, deliberate, self-effacing, and yet quietly cruel. Latin was the perfect disguise. It made sentiment sound like theology. Later that day, I studied the document in my office. The handwriting was not Fenton's. His notes, I recalled, had the precision of a surveyor. This script was broader, looser, the letters leaning toward one another like conspirators. But the signature was genuine. I checked it twice. The translation, however, troubled me. The word donare appeared where leger might have sufficed. To give rather than to bequeath. The distinction is small but treacherous. Donar implies transfer during life. Fenton's will might not have been a will at all, but a confession written too late to be received. Lewis arrived with tea, his expression thoughtful. He'd been asking around. It seemed the bursar and the master had quarreled 3 weeks earlier about a budgetary irregularity, a phrase Oxford uses when morality grows inconvenient. He said perhaps she'd convinced him to amend the will in exchange for silence. I told him that was possible, though not probable. Silence, I said, is rarely a currency anyone trades for long. He left soon after, and I was alone again with the paper. I ran my finger along the margin where the ink had bled slightly. Someone had touched it before it dried. A careless hand, or a loving one. I could almost see the scene of 2 people in the bursar's room, the candle between them, the document still damp. She watched him sign. He looked away. Guilt like wax, cooling into permanence. That night I took down my Latin dictionary, a relic from another, lonelier life. I looked up virtues. It meant not only virtue, but strength, manliness, and moral courage. Words that sound noble and taste of irony. I closed the book and poured a measure of whiskey. Outside, the college bell struck 10, slow and uncertain. I thought again of that amendment, of the hand that guided it, of a library meant to cultivate truth. Oxford, I decided, prefers its virtues translated and its sins left in the original tongue. It was Lewis who suggested the evening at the Sheldonian. He said I needed distraction, as though music were a form of anesthetic. I let him believe it was his idea, though the truth was simpler. I wanted to see Lorna Vane again, away from the corridors that turned conversation into chess. The concert was Mozart Don Giovanni, or at least a condensed version of it, staged by the university orchestra. Oxford students always overreach with grace. Even mediocrity sounds earnest in that hall. I remember the air that night, sharp with rain, the kind that leaves its scent rather than its weight. I had arrived early, not to find my seat, but to listen to the tuning. The chaos before order. It felt appropriate. From my place near the aisle, I could see her across the auditorium, the Master of St. Bride's, poised in the second row, the pale silk of her scarf catching the lamplight. She looked like someone rehearsing composure. When our eyes met briefly, inevitably I thought of the will, the Latin phrases still echoing in my head like a psalm no one believed. The overture began, a bright deceit of sound, and I felt that familiar ache of admiration and suspicion. Music, like Oxford, persuades you that clarity is possible. It isn't. Somewhere around the end of the first act, I noticed a man on the balcony, Alden, the theologian. He watched the stage, but his attention was elsewhere. His hand moved inside his coat pocket, touching something repeatedly. A small gesture, anxious and deliberate. A cigarette, perhaps, or a note folded too many times. I leaned back, and the idea began to form a shape without edges, but recognizable all the same. During the interval, I found Lorna near the foyer, speaking with the dean. When she saw me, she smiled the way one does in dreams politely, with an undertone of fear. She said she was surprised to see me out of uniform, and I told her that even cynics attend concerts, especially those dedicated to the art of deception. She laughed softly. We spoke of Fenton then, in the elliptical way that grief demands. She said he had been blackmailing her. I asked if she was certain, and she said certainty was the only thing she no longer possessed. She left before I could answer. I didn't follow her immediately. Lewis had gone outside for air, and when I joined him beneath the portico, he said he'd just seen Alden in the side alley, counting money from an envelope. The notes were damp from the rain. He pocketed them when he saw us and disappeared toward Broad Street. Lewis muttered something about motive and timing, but my thoughts were elsewhere. The envelope, I recalled, had been of the same cream stock as the one used for Fenton's correspondence. Perhaps coincidence, though Oxford seldom has traffic in those. We returned for the second half, and I found it impossible to concentrate. The aria Dalla sua pace began with tenderness disguised as faith. It's the kind of music that insists on forgiveness, even as it mourns its absence. I looked again for Lorna, but found her seat empty. Only the scarf remained, draped over the rail like a question too weary to be answered. When the concert ended, I waited by the doors, watching the audience disperse into the rain. Alden reappeared, eyes hollow, collar upturned. I asked him whether he'd enjoyed the performance. He said he'd never cared for Mozart. Too indulgent, too human. I told him that was precisely the point. He looked at me then, as though measuring what I already knew, and said nothing more. Back home, I poured a whiskey and listened to the silence left behind by the music. The word indulgent echoed in my head. Fenton's death had been arranged with indulgence. Too careful, too symmetrical, like a composition edited for posterity. And yet, amid that orchestration, one note refused to resolve. The candle, the will, the altered hand, the missing truth. A concert of errors, I thought, each player convinced he knew the score. I stared out into the night and wondered if, somewhere in that rain, the final cadence had already begun. There comes a moment in every investigation when the pattern appears complete, the picture resolved, the final note struck, and yet something faint inside resists belief. I remember that moment clearly in Fenton's case, the brief satisfaction of having an answer that looked, at least from a distance, like truth. It was Alden who carried the burden of guilt that week, and I let him have it, or perhaps I let myself. The evidence had arranged itself with unusual cooperation. His debts, long whispered about in the cloisters, had reached the bursar's ears. Fenton, meticulous even in generosity, had lent him money against the college's discretionary fund. The bank records showed a repayment made days before the death. The envelope Lewis saw outside the Sheldonian contained the very notes withdrawn from Fenton's account. There were, of course, the smaller details that adorn any tidy accusation: Alden's nervousness, his vanished alibi, the convenient theology of forgiveness that his sermons so quietly rehearsed. It was, as Lewis called it, an open and shut case. He said so with that small grin he reserves for the rare occasions when he thinks I might agree with him. I didn't, but I said nothing. We arrested Alden in his rooms that morning. He did not protest. His manner was almost clerical, the resignation of a man accustomed to confession. He admitted to visiting Fenton on the night of the death. He had gone, he said, to beg for an extension, to plead that the debt be erased. They argued. Fenton collapsed. He panicked, fled, and left the door locked behind him. No mention of poison or violence or theft, merely panic. It was plausible, and that was precisely what troubled me. In courtrooms and classrooms alike, plausibility is the most elegant form of deceit. It gives the appearance of reason without the burden of proof. I had seen it too often in Oxford, in lectures, in love, and now in murder. Still, I signed the report, watched the college exhale its collective relief, and told myself that the unease would pass. It didn't. A few nights later, I returned to St. Bride's. The college had fallen into its usual rhythm: candles in the chapel, port in the senior common room, a Latin grace intoned without conviction. The bursar's staircase, though, felt different. I stood in the doorway of Fenton's rooms, listening to the silence that seemed to hum with unfinished thought. On the desk lay the remnants of the police inventory. I noticed again the small photograph beside the blotter of a college cricket team from 20 years earlier. Fenton, younger, leaner, at the edge of the frame. Beside him, the faint blur of another face, half erased by light. I'd seen it before and ignored it. That was my first mistake. I sat down and poured a drink from the decanter still standing in its place. The label had worn off, but the faint medicinal scent caught my attention. I remembered the autopsy report traces of morphine, self-administered. The coroner had assumed it a symptom of long-term illness, but Fenton, as far as I knew, had none. Why morphine, unless one expected pain or wished to imitate it? It was then that the earlier image returned to me of the candle, burned to half its length. I recalled the porter's statement that Fenton timed his medication by wax, marking hours with a notch. But the candle that night had not burned evenly. Its surface was too smooth, too deliberate. A new candle substituted for an old one. Someone had falsified the hour of death, not to condemn Alden, but to free him from suspicion entirely. A mercy, perhaps, extended by one who loved too quietly. I left the room without turning on the light. Outside, the rain had begun again, steady and unhurried. Lewis would not thank me for reopening the case, nor would the college. But I knew then that our answer, like the candle, had burned too quickly, too brightly, to be real. Truth, I have found, prefers to arrive late, long after the applause has faded, when no one is still listening. And that night, standing under the archway, I realized the investigation had not ended at all. It had only paused, waiting for its final correction. It was not a grand revelation that came to me, but something smaller, a slow erosion of certainty. I had spent the morning convincing myself that the case was finished, that Alden's guilt, however ill-fitting, would suffice. Yet by dusk, the lie had begun to leak through the cracks like water finding its level. It started with a report I'd meant to ignore, a note from the pathologist mentioning morphine traces in Fenton's blood. Therapeutic levels, he'd written, though his tone on the telephone suggested unease. I asked him what therapeutic meant in this context. He said it depended on whether the patient had been ill. Fenton, of course, had not been. I sat for a long while after that, the window half open to the sound of rain dripping from the eaves. Each fall landed with such quiet precision that I began counting them. It's a habit of mine that the number brings order, but numbers, like people, lie when it suits them. I thought again of the candle, that single object whose defiance of time had mocked every tidy conclusion. I took out the photograph from the file and studied it under the lamplight. The wax was clean, no soot around the rim, the wick still long. Not the work of an ordinary flame. It had burned slower, too slowly, as though designed to deceive the hours. Lewis arrived, dripping himself, his coat dark with the same relentless rain. He said the college had begun to relax, that the newspapers were moving on. Good, he added, meaning closure. I asked him whether he believed in closure. He said he believed in evidence. I told him evidence was only the truth's shadow, and shadows, by nature, depend on light. He looked at me the way a younger man looks at the older version he hopes never to become. Then he mentioned Judith Larkin. She'd been seen that afternoon at the chemist's on Beaumont Street, purchasing paraffin. Nothing criminal in that, he added, but perhaps worth noting. It was. Later, when I called on her, the light in her office had that same familiar quality. Too steady, too composed. A candle burned on her desk, thick and waxy, its flame barely moving despite the draft from the window. She asked if the investigation was finally over. Her tone was even, but the question felt rehearsed. I said it might be, though something about Fenton's last hours still resisted understanding. She nodded, pretending sympathy, yet her eyes betrayed exhaustion rather than grief. I asked about the candle in the bursar's room, whether she remembered where it had come from. She hesitated. The college stores, I think. They all look alike. I told her they didn't. The cheaper ones gutter. The better ones last longer, and sometimes people choose them for that reason, to delay an ending. She turned away then, her fingers tightening around a paper knife. For a moment, I almost pitied her. Some crimes, I've found, are not born of malice, but of misplaced tenderness. Before leaving, I noticed a small blue box on the shelf, the kind used for laboratory chemicals. Beneath the label, faint smudges of wax. I said nothing. Back at my flat, I poured a whiskey and set the glass on the windowsill. The rain had eased to a drizzle, the city breathing again after confession. I opened the file once more, scanning the pathologist's addendum: morphine detected in self-administered dosage, possible combination with sedative compound. A simple phrase, but it changed everything. Fenton had not been murdered. He had arranged his own departure. The candle had been altered not to kill, but to protect, to disguise suicide as peace. Someone had replaced it to spare him humiliation. A false mercy, perhaps, but mercy nonetheless. The next morning I returned to St. Bride's. The candle from Larkin's desk was gone, the wax scraped clean from its holder. In the bursar's rooms, the air still carried the faintest scent of paraffin sweetness and decay entwined. I stood there listening to the steady drip of rain from the gutter above the window, each fall a small, reluctant truth. Not revelation, not justice, just time resuming its quiet rhythm after deceit. And as I closed the door, I realized that the case had never been about guilt or innocence at all. It was about love, the kind that burns too slowly and dies too late. I'd gone to St. Bride's that morning, not to complain, but to listen. There are moments in every investigation when truth no longer hides in evidence, only in silence, and Judith Larkin had cultivated silence better than anyone I knew. Her office overlooked the chapel garden, a small rectangle of grass that seemed perpetually wet, perpetually expectant. When she asked if I wanted tea, I said yes, though I didn't drink it. The ritual, I'd found, often helped people misremember the line between honesty and performance. She began with the usual courtesies, then drifted into the past tense without noticing. Fenton had been difficult, she said, particularly about time, about routine. I told her I already knew that. She smiled, not kindly. "You always do," she said. The cup trembled slightly when she set it down, and I saw that her hands were marked by faint burns, the kind left by candle wax. It was a small thing, but it turned the air between us into a confession. I told her I had revisited the bursar's rooms, that the candle had burned slower than it should have, that someone had tampered with the scene. She didn't deny it. Instead, she asked what difference it made if a man wished to die on his own terms. I said none, if those terms didn't involve deceit. She looked at me for a long time, as though trying to decide whether deceit and kindness could ever be the same act. "He called me that evening," she said. He sounded calm, almost gentle. I went to him because I thought he was ill. He wasn't. He'd already taken the morphine. The candle was still burning. He asked me to let it mark the hour, the last one he would measure. When he stopped speaking, I panicked. I changed the candle. I wanted it to look as though he had died earlier, quietly, like any tired old man who'd forgotten to wind his watch. The story unfolded without tears. She spoke like someone translating her own guilt into a language too formal to feel. She had known Fenton for 20 years, first as a student, later as a colleague. He had promised her nothing, and she had asked for even less. Their intimacy was of that English variety that survives best unspoken. When she found him slumped in the chair, she hadn't screamed, hadn't called anyone. She'd replaced the candle, arranged the papers, and washed the glass. He deserved order, she said. It was the only thing he ever truly worshipped. I asked why she hadn't told me sooner. She said because confession doesn't undo anything, it only shifts the weight. She'd waited until I'd begun to suspect, so that I might hear it without triumph. A strange mercy, perhaps, but mercy all the same. Lewis arrived halfway through. I saw him in the doorway, unsure whether to interrupt. Judith turned toward him and said she wished no pity, only quiet. He nodded, awkward, almost reverent. She asked if there would be charges. I said not from me. The law, I told her, prefers its tragedies simple. She smiled faintly. I don't think the law has ever been to Oxford. When she left the room, I noticed the candle on her desk had guttered, a thin curl of smoke still rising. I stood there a moment longer, the air heavy with wax and something else, not sorrow exactly, but its residue. Lewis said she seemed decent enough, that she'd only done what anyone might for someone they cared for. I told him that care is rarely innocent, and that sometimes decency is simply another word for love, afraid of itself. He didn't answer. That night, back in my flat, I wrote her name in my notebook and drew a line through it. Not to erase her, but to release her. Outside, Oxford lay drenched in rain, the streets reflecting lamps like softened memories. I poured a measure of whiskey and let it stand untouched on the sill. The candle that had burned too slowly had been hers all along, an act of tenderness mistaken for deception, or perhaps the other way around. I still don't know which. All I know is that it flickered for him when no one else would, and that, in its wavering light, I saw the faint outline of my own loneliness. Evening returned to Oxford with the tired grace of a curtain falling after a too long play. The city was rinsed clean by rain, its lamps trembling in shallow puddles, its voices softened to murmurs. I walked through the gate of St. Bride's for what I knew would be the last time. Lewis had gone ahead to file his report. Tidy words for an untidy truth, and the porter, seeing me cross the quad, offered a nod that was almost respectful. News of Judith Larkin's confession had already filtered through the college, though stripped, of course, of tenderness. Oxford always edits emotion into propriety. The bursar's staircase was open, the door unlatched. I paused halfway up, listening to the creak of each step, the small sighs of a building that had learned to outlive its scandals. Fenton's rooms were being cleared. 2 men from the college office were packing books into boxes, their hands careful, impersonal. The smell of old paper and wax hung faintly still. On the mantel, where the candle once stood, a ring of pale residue remained, a ghost of light. I traced it with a finger, as one might trace a scar, and thought of how easily devotion can burn itself into deception. Lewis arrived soon after, shaking rain from his coat. He said it was all settled, the coroner satisfied, the college grateful, and the world ready to resume its routine. He asked if I believed her, and I said yes, though belief in such matters is rarely pure. He hesitated, then said perhaps she'd done the right thing. I told him that rightness is only ever clear to the living, never to the dead. He frowned, trying to decide whether I was being cynical or kind. I wasn't sure myself. The master found us in the corridor, her expression composed in that practiced academic way, the face of someone who has read too many elegies to write another. She thanked me and said the college owed me a debt. I replied that Oxford has never been good at repayment. She smiled faintly and asked what I thought of Fenton now that the dust had settled. I said he'd been neither better nor worse than the rest of us, merely more punctual in meeting his end. She didn't laugh, though her eyes softened just for a moment before she turned away. Later, I wandered alone into the chapel. A small service was being prepared for evensong. A student choir rehearsed quietly under the carved ceiling. Their voices floated up like fragile smoke, not sorrowful, merely resigned. I sat near the back, watching the candles being lit along the altar rail. Each one flickered uncertainly at first, then steadied, their light trembling against the dark wood. I found myself counting them 10, 12, 14, and then stopped, realizing the futility of numbers. Truth, like faith, resists arithmetic. When the music ended, the verger approached and asked if I would stay for the service. I said no, that I had somewhere to be. He nodded, as though understanding, though I doubted he did. As I left, a single candle sputtered, casting a brief flare across the brass memorials on the wall, names long dead, dates long irrelevant. One inscription caught my eye, Lux Aeterna Luceat Eis, eternal light. I murmured the words, unsure whether they were a prayer or a habit. Outside, the rain had thinned to a mist. The quads shimmered beneath the lamps, their reflections scattered like fragments of thought. I stood there for a while, watching the water slide across the cobbles, erasing footprints faster than memory could preserve them. Somewhere behind me, a window closed with a quiet finality. St. Bride's had already begun the process of forgetting. By the time I reached the gate, the bells from the chapel had started again slow, deliberate, neither mournful nor celebratory. I thought of Judith, of her steady hands arranging that final scene, of the candle burning too slowly beside a dying man who wanted his end to look like peace. Perhaps it was. Perhaps not. Some truths, I've learned, fade not with discovery, but with forgiveness. I looked back once more at the college, its windows glowing faintly against the dark. The light was dimmer now, diffused through rain and distance. Soon it would vanish altogether, absorbed into the night. I turned away before it did, though in my mind, even now, that last candle still burns small, patient, and impossibly slow.